I have been officially challenged to come up with this particular video, which is a if you like this book, then try this book kind of a book recommendation video. But the problem I have is that you cannot necessarily compare apples and oranges just because they're both fruit. There's a superficial level of comparison, there's a deeper themes and messaging level of comparison, and of course then there's just the idea of the same vibes coming from two very different books. And I think that it's really difficult to recommend people books if you're not very clear on how these two books are similar. To start off, I think we should do a book comparison of just superficial books. If you like small purple grapes and fruit, then you may also really enjoy blackberries, which are also small and sweet. Not exactly the same, but kind of superficially similar. You get what I'm saying? So our first superficial book pairs are gonna be Calculating the Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal. I probably said that wrong. And A History of What Comes Next by Sylvain Neuvel. Again, I'm sorry if I butcher these names. Both of these are alternate history books with just some sprinkling in of some science and some science fiction elements. Calculating the Stars is more about adding women to the space program and an alternate history, and A History of What Comes Next is about the space program, but it's also mixed in over in Russia. So I'm gonna leave that one a little bit more nebulous, but these books are very superficially connected in terms of they're both alternate histories, they both have science fiction, and I feel like they're both kind of slow burns. The next book pairing is Memory Called Empire and Nine Fox Gambit. These two books are again superficially paired because they both use the trope of a female protagonist with a male personality inside her head trying to help her make decisions or navigate her through difficult choices. So this is not a trope that I see particularly often, and I think of one book or the other because they both use it. Granted, each book has a very different tone and a different plot, but this is kind of a cool idea and I think can be related. Next is going to be Empire of Silence by Christopher Ruccio, paired with Deathstalker by Simon Green. These books have very different tones. Deathstalker does not take itself very seriously, whereas Empire of Silence very much does. But both of these books are essentially epic space operas, and both of them deal with Roman gladiators, but with space elements to them, and they both kind of have a hero, questionable villain story or journey. The next book pairing is going to be Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card with Grass by Sherry Tepper. Now, this seems like a strange pairing, but I do have to say, Grass really reminded me of Speaker for the Dead in many elements. Even though the stories are completely different, the biology of the aliens, I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going to give that away, in both Speaker for the Dead and in Grass are both spectacular. They both deal with first contact with difficulty or second contact with difficulty. I do think that there is some kind of connection there. Now let's move on to a little bit of a deeper comparison. This comparison is going to be kind of a weird one because I want to talk about the themes or the messages of the books. And this does mean that I'm going to be comparing like cheese to yogurt. You wouldn't think that those two would be comparable, but when you think about it a little bit harder, they're both dairy products, they're both really good snacks, they're both individually great probiotics, so there's some similarities there even though superficially they don't mix. Let's go ahead and do our very first pairing. And this one, I'm cheating a little bit because it's my video. I'm gonna have more than one recommendation for this book. And that is gonna be 1984 by George Orwell. This book may be a hard book to pair with initially, but I'm going to pair it with three books I have specifically for it. The first is gonna be Quality Land. The second book is gonna be a book by John Brunner called The Sheep Look Up. And then the third book is going to be We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, which I'm sure I'm saying absolutely terribly. All of these books are going to go all together. What 1984 does is it's a dystopian world that is warning us that if we don't make different decisions, we're going to end up in a bad place. It is essentially a warning novel. And it is a really heavy themed novel in terms of what dangers the government can represent. I really think that a lot of these other books are books that have these same themes. Quality Land is again very different in tone. It is a German book that is a dystopian where Amazon takes over the world. And it is very satirical, it is very tongue-in-cheek, but if you can get underneath that humor, you're gonna really get a lot of truth. And you're gonna see how a lot of those things are happening in our society today. So you just have to get underneath some of the satire, and you're really gonna start to understand how this book is also a warning, and it's also really heavy in themes, and it's a very, very good book. Another one that I mentioned here is The Sheep Look Up by John Brunner. This too is a dystopian novel that is warning us that if we don't clean up our act about the environment is going to collapse in many terrible, terrible ways, and is very bleak and dire in the same way that 1984 is. And I feel like these books would be something where if you really liked 1984, I think you will also really enjoy John Brunner's The Sheep Look Up. And then the last book was We, and of course I had to put this on there even though it's kind of cheating, and that's because We by Yevgeny Zamyatin is basically the book that inspired 1984, and so they both deal with dire consequences of terrible governments. So of course they're related because one inspired the other, but if you haven't read it, you should. They're great. Okay, so the next one in this list is going to be Murderbot series by Martha Wells, and I'm going to pair it with Sea of Rust. This seems like rather a superficial comparison, but if you think about Murderbot in terms of the fact that it's an AI with a very well-developed emotional life, and this AI is trying to develop coping mechanisms to get over its particular problem. So this ethical problem or mental problem is actually some social anxiety and introversion and an aversion to social situations, which it gets over with soap operas, of course. And then if we look at Sea of Rust, we have another AI character that's actually trying to get over the ethical implications of what its species, the robots, did to all of humanity, and that is destroyed it. It happened before the book, don't worry, that's not a spoiler. This story is really about the main character, Brittle, the robot, trying to get over what the robots did to humanity. And so both books are AIs, and both books are dealing with the same messaging of these very intricate, emotional, slow burn kind of a story that's trying to get through some kind of emotional conflict. The next one that we have on this list is Beggars in Spain by Nancy Kress, which I'm pairing with Dogs of War by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now again, this seems like a very strange pairing, but Beggars in Spain is a novella that is essentially about genetic manipulation, and in particular, it focuses on genetic manipulation of taking away our need for sleep. And regardless of what the specifics are, it really is diving deep into how this affects our society as a whole and what the ramifications are for just a teeny tiny genetic manipulation. Adrian Tchaikovsky's book, Dog of War, and the second book, Bearhead, actually deal with the same thing in terms of genetic manipulation and the potential consequences that it would have on society in both right now and the far-flung future. And it is a particularly good and very prescient little duology. The way that the genetic manipulation happens in these books is very different. It really has some of the same themes and the same messaging. Now let's move on to our next category, the books that have the same vibe or feel. I'm going to compare to ice cream and cake. I mean, both are desserts, but they're very, very different desserts. But they both leave the same vibe. They are both something that you choose when you're done with a meal, and they both leave you happy at the end. So this is how I'm deciding the vibes of the two different kinds of stories. And the first one I have for you is Little Fuzzies by H. Beam Piper. This is a book I've talked about on my channel before and is criminally underrated. It is very much a slow burn slice of life, but it's also first contact, and it also has some good themes. And I'm going to combine this book and match it with Remnant Population by Elizabeth Moon. These books have very similar vibes in terms of slice of life, despite the fact that they're both dealing with heavy themes and heavy consequences, but they're very easy to get through. They just both have that same similar vibe. I will probably also need to add into this, and we'll make it a trilogy, John Scalzi's version of H. Beam Piper's Little Fuzzies, and that is Fuzzy Nation. You could probably put almost any other John Scalzi in this matchup because I do feel like a lot of his books have very similar vibes to these books. Let's move on to our next book recipe. This one, we're going to take Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, and we're gonna mix it with a fantasy novel, The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. And we're gonna mix them together, and we're going to bake it on 325, and we're going to get the book Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff. I'm really shocked to say this, but it is a perfect recipe of this book. It takes so many of the plot elements of The Name of the Wind, and it also adds in so many of the deep themes of Interview with the Vampire, and then it kind of becomes its own thing. So if you like the idea of combining these two books together, you will definitely love the vibe of Empire of the Vampire. Let's do another quick book recipe. This is gonna be an interesting one. We're gonna take the book Game of Thrones, the entire series by George R.R. Martin, and we're going to mix it with The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin, which is very strange. And then we're gonna add in sprinklings of Red Rising series. And when we put all of those books together, we're going to get the Luna New Moon book by Ian McDaniel. This is the first of a trilogy, and it really takes all of the ruling houses who are all fighting and vying for power and better placement, kind of similar to Game of Thrones, but there's a little bit of the revenge in there from Red Rising series. And then there's also going to be some of the dryness and the politicking in The Dispossessed, and it's gonna be kind of a giant mashup. So if that sounds intriguing to you, definitely check out New Moon. It is quite a ride. The next one that we're going to do is gonna be Pride and Prejudice, and we're going to match it with Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This one could have gone in multiple of these categories because, to be honest, it does have some superficial feel in terms of Pride and Prejudice is a Victorian era classic, and Guns of the Dawn is also happening in the Victorian era. We also see some similar messaging in terms of both pride and prejudice in order to get through some kind of possible love story. The vibes and feel of this, you're really going to understand what I'm talking about if you get through this book. If you happen to be a fan of any of the Bronte sisters, you have to give Guns of the Dawn a try. It does have a little tiny bit of magic involved, but it's not really explained, and it's not really something that the main character has to deal with a whole lot. Definitely just read that one, give it a try. Trust me, you'll like it. And the last one is probably the most controversial mashup I have, and this is the one that I'm going to say I'm not going to apologize for, because this one is true similar vibes. This one is not related at all, except it made me feel the same way. So we're going to take The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, and we're gonna match it with Foundation and Empire by Isaac Asimov. I know, these are so different, but hear me out. So when I was reading Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, there's a couple of twists and turns throughout the book. Whether you saw them coming or not, they were pleasurable in my reading experience. And then at the very end, we had another twist and turn, and then the final line in the book was a very awesome zingy quip that just made me feel so satisfied. It was one of those drop the mic book moments of pure perfection. I just put down the book and I was wholly satisfied with that novel. And Isaac Asimov's Foundation and Empire, which is the second book in his Foundation series, made me feel the same way. It had a couple of twists and turns in the middle of the book and then towards the end of the book, and then it finished on such a cool, quippy zinger that I was just so excited to finish that book. I loved it. I was so satisfied. These two books made me feel the same way. I think I might have discovered my secret recipe for satisfaction, and that is you gotta have 2 twists in your book with a zingy ending, and I'm just over it. It's just my very favorite thing in the whole world. So let me know in the comments section down below which of these you agree with, and if you want to see more videos like this, or if maybe we could just move on. I totally understand that I think very differently than everyone else. Until next time, you guys, see ya.